The laughter erupted like a thunderclap across the golden hall. Richard Sterling, billionaire investor and self-declared king of the evening, leaned forward under the chandelier's glow. He pointed at the young receptionist beside the poker table. "Prove you're worth it," he said, voice dripping with amusement. The crowd laughed with him, their jeweled hands clinking glasses. Clara Hayes didn't answer, only adjusted the cards before her, eyes steady, pulse silent. The room was alive with the scent of champagne and expensive perfume, but around Clara the air grew still. She could hear the hum of the lights above, the faint shuffle of silk dresses, the quiet tremor of her own breath. No one expected her to last a single round. She was the evening's entertainment, the servant-turned-spectacle. Yet something about her stillness unsettled even the cruelest smile. Richard's laughter echoed rich and practiced, the sound of a man too used to being admired. The guests watched like predators at a hunt, waiting for the weak to falter. But Clara wasn't prey. Beneath the rhythm of her calm breathing, her mind worked in silence, calculating, observing, remembering. She had seen this kind of power before, loud, certain, and terrified of silence. He slid a pile of chips across the green felt, the sound sharp, like a challenge. "If you lose," he said, "you lose your job." The words hung in the air, careless for him, but a sentence for her. Her fingers brushed the edge of the deck, measuring every heartbeat around the table. The dealer's gaze flickered with pity, but Clara gave no sign of fear. Behind her composed expression, memories stirred. Her father's voice teaching her the rhythm of numbers, the patience of probability, the art of watching before moving. Poker is never about chance, he'd say, it's about people. And tonight, the richest man in the room had already revealed his hand without showing a single card. Her first play was quiet, almost hesitant, but not weak. She folded early, earning another wave of laughter from the crowd. Richard smirked, certain she didn't belong. Yet while he counted his chips, she counted his patterns, the twitch of his jaw when bluffing, the rhythm of his tapping fingers when impatient. Every insult he threw was data, every smile was a tell. As the night unfolded, her silence became its own kind of voice. The waiters slowed their steps, the laughter faded, and curiosity began to ripple through the guests. The girl in red, once dismissed as decoration, was still there, unshaken. Richard's charm began to harden into irritation. He could command money, attention, admiration, but not her composure. When the cards turned again, Clara's eyes never left his. "You play well," Richard said, though the words were hollow. "I watch carefully," she replied softly, her tone disarming. It was the first time she'd spoken since sitting down, and the silence that followed carried more weight than all his boasts combined. A faint tremor crossed his smile as she placed her bet, firm and exact. The crowd leaned in. Something in the air shifted, an invisible tide turning. For the first time, Richard wasn't entirely sure he controlled the game. And Clara, still silent, was beginning to see that fear flicker behind his grin. She drew her next card, eyes calm as candlelight. Around her, the room seemed to blur, laughter fading, light softening, time itself slowing. The girl no one believed in was about to make her first move. And though no one knew it yet, the game that began in mockery was about to end in revelation. The game was over, but the echoes remained. Laughter still clung to the velvet curtains like smoke after a fire. Clara Hayes gathered the scattered cards one by one, as if tidying away the last fragments of her own dignity. No one helped her, no one spoke. The chandeliers hummed above, their glitter now cold and indifferent. She walked through the ballroom like a ghost, the shine of her red vest dulled beneath the golden light. The marble floor reflected her image, poised on the surface, cracked beneath. Her heels clicked softly, every sound a quiet defiance against the room that had mocked her. Pride held her upright, but pain lingered behind her composure, sharp and invisible. At the edge of the corridor, she stopped to breathe. The noise had faded, but the humiliation replayed in her mind, every laugh, every glance. She pressed her hands together, feeling the warmth still trapped in her palms. The scent of perfume and whiskey floated through the air, thick with memory. Silence was supposed to heal, but tonight it only reminded her of what hurt. The sound of Richard Sterling's laughter returned in her mind, distant now, but still cutting. It wasn't the game that wounded her. It was the cruelty dressed as charm, the applause that fed on her discomfort. She wondered how many people in that room had once been her, quiet, invisible, made into entertainment for someone else's pride. Outside, through the tall windows, New York shimmered like 1,000 false promises. Lights blinked, cars moved, and the city went on, unaware of the small heartbreak happening within its walls. Clara watched it all in silence, searching for something steady, something pure. Somewhere beneath that glittering skyline, truth still lived. In her reflection on the glass, she saw the outline of a woman she almost didn't recognize. The exhaustion, the pain, the restraint, it all lived behind her calm face, but so did something else, awareness. She had seen the limits of arrogance and the quiet strength of endurance. "You don't scare me anymore," she whispered to the reflection. She straightened her posture, fixed her collar and smoothed her hair. The discipline in her gestures gave her comfort. Apologies wouldn't come, she knew that. But she didn't need them. People like Richard believed silence meant surrender. He was wrong. Silence could be resistance too, elegant, invisible and powerful. As she passed one of the ornate mirrors near the exit, she paused. Her red vest glowed faintly against the dim hallway lights. For a brief moment, she saw not a servant but a survivor. Her hands, once used to serve, had steadied through humiliation. Dignity, she realized, wasn't taken. It was tested. And tonight, she had passed. Down the corridor, she could still hear faint laughter and the soft melody of the closing band. It no longer hurt the same way. "Prove you're worth it," Richard had said. She smiled faintly now, the words echoing back with a different tone. Challenge accepted, not endured. When she stepped into the cold night air, the city wrapped around her like truth. The laughter was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of traffic and wind. It wasn't silence anymore. It was space, the kind that allows wounds to breathe. Clara Hayes walked away slowly, not defeated but waiting. Because sometimes waiting is the first act of victory. Morning light spilled through thin curtains, touching the edges of a small kitchen in Brooklyn. The room was modest, filled with warmth rather than wealth. The smell of toast, the soft hum of an old radio, the faint sound of her mother humming a hymn. Clara Hayes sat at the table, barefoot, shuffling a deck of worn playing cards. Across from her, her father smiled, eyes bright beneath years of quiet struggle. "Patience," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's the first rule of any game worth playing." He placed his cards face down, teaching her not to rush. Clara watched every movement, memorizing the calm in his hands. "Winning isn't about beating others," he continued. "It's about understanding them." She nodded, not yet realizing those words would guide her far beyond this table. Her father never played for money, only for clarity. "Luck fades," he would tell her, "but perception lasts." They would play for hours, not speaking much, just studying the rhythm of silence between turns. Her mother would pass behind them, smiling as she wiped flour from her hands. "The world won't always be kind to quiet souls," she warned gently, "but don't let it make you loud." Those mornings were golden in their simplicity. The walls might have been cracked, but laughter filled the spaces money never could. Her father would wink at her before work, slipping a single card from the deck into her pocket, a secret between them. "Keep one close," he'd say, "to remember that patience wins longer games." The card always changed, but the lesson never did. Years passed, and life moved faster than their small apartment could hold. Her father's health declined, her mother aged quietly, and Clara took the first job she could find, a receptionist at one of Richard Sterling's hotels. It was supposed to be temporary, a stepping stone. Yet day by day she began to see the other side of luxury, how people with power often mistook silence for insignificance. Still, Clara never stopped observing. She noticed the way guests spoke to servers, how executives treated kindness like currency, how Richard's name floated through hallways with reverence and fear. The deck of cards stayed in her bag, a private reminder that perception, not position, decides the outcome of every game. At night, she'd sit by the small window of her apartment, city lights reflecting on her glass of tea. She'd take out her father's cards and shuffle them slowly, feeling the soft rhythm beneath her fingers. The cards whispered memory and meaning. Each one reminded her that life was just a table, unpredictable, yes, but fair to those who waited long enough to see the truth unfold. Sometimes she imagined what her father would say if he could see her now, serving drinks to millionaires, her smile a shield against condescension. "Watch them," he would remind her. "They'll always reveal themselves." She smiled faintly at the thought, whispering, "I am watching," and she was, always. The world around her was built on pretense, but Clara moved through it with quiet grace. Every rude remark, every arrogant laugh became a note in her private symphony of understanding. She learned that people like Richard Sterling didn't need to be fought. They needed to be seen, and that realization was more dangerous than any weapon. When she closed her eyes that night, she saw her father's hand dealing one last card, the Queen of Hearts. "For luck," he'd said. She placed it on her nightstand, the light from the city flickering across its surface. "For patience," she whispered back. And though she didn't know it yet, that same card would one day return to her at the exact moment she'd need it most. The ballroom glittered once more, every crystal shimmering like 1,000 eyes watching for weakness. Richard Sterling had reclaimed his throne at the center table, his reputation polished back into place. The air smelled of wealth and cologne, arrogance masked as sophistication. Clara Hayes, summoned again under the guise of professionalism, entered quietly through the service door. She moved like light, slipping through shadows, unnoticed until it was too late. When Richard saw her, a smirk crept across his face, practiced and deliberate. "Back for another round?" he asked, voice casual but edged with memory. Clara met his gaze, calm as still water. "I'm here to work, Mr. Sterling," she said softly. "Nothing more." "Indeed," but both knew it was more. Fate rarely knocks twice without reason. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Then sit," he said, the challenge unspoken but thick in the air. She hesitated only a heartbeat before doing so. The dealer began to shuffle, cards whispering against green felt like secrets being rearranged. Around them the wealthy guests gathered again, curiosity disguised as charm. The game, it seemed, was not finished. Richard spoke as he played, his voice smooth as polished marble. "I have to admit, you surprised me," he said. "Most people would have quit after a night like that." Clara smiled faintly, eyes on her cards. "Most people don't like unfinished stories." He chuckled, though the sound held unease. Power once questioned rarely feels safe again. The first few hands were light, cautious. Richard played to impress, she to understand. His rhythm was predictable, his charm measured, but Clara noticed something different tonight. a hesitation between his gestures, a faint tremor hidden beneath confidence. She remembered her father's words, "Watch the small things. They always reveal the truth." He leaned closer, voice lower now. "You study people, don't you?" he asked. "It's part of the job," she replied evenly. He smiled, but his eyes flickered with irritation. "Dangerous habit," he said. "Knowing too much can make enemies." Clara looked up then, meeting his stare. "Or it can make peace," she whispered. For the first time, Richard looked away. The dealer announced a new round. Richard pushed a stack of chips toward the center, arrogance returning like armor. "Let's make this interesting," he said. Clara tilted her head. "Interesting," she murmured, "isn't always wise." The guests laughed lightly, unsure whom to favor. Under the chandelier's glow, their two reflections shimmered across the table, predator and mirror, locked in silent understanding. As the cards fell, Clara's movements were fluid, precise. She folded early twice, watched once, and stayed on the third. Richard mistook her stillness for weakness. He smiled broadly, the way a man smiles before certain victory. "You really should learn when to quit," he said. Clara's lips curved slightly. "I did," she answered, "the night I stopped playing your game." His smile faltered for a heartbeat, then returned sharper. Around them, conversation hushed, the air thickened with anticipation. He called her Bet with theatrical flair, expecting another easy win. But when the cards turned, the tension shifted. Clara hadn't won the hand, but she had won something far more important, his attention. And that, she knew, was how all real games begin. As the evening wore on, their dialogue turned quieter, stripped of showmanship. Between every move, a truth unfolded. He played for control, she for understanding. Power, she realized, wasn't in possession, it was in perception. When the last card fell, Richard smiled out of habit, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. He was starting to sense it, the beginning of his own unraveling. The next round began before Clara could fully steady her breath. Richard Sterling was in command again, his voice booming, laughter polished to perfection. He toyed with his chips like a conductor leading an orchestra, the crowd hanging on his every gesture. She mirrored calm, but inside she felt the familiar ache of pressure rising. This time, one misread move was all it took, and the table turned. The final card hit the felt with a cruel sort of elegance. Richard leaned back, triumphant, eyes glinting under chandelier light. "You lasted longer than I expected," he said, tone drenched in charm that tasted like poison. The room applauded his victory, not realizing it was hollow. Clara Hayes nodded once, quiet, her face unreadable. "Congratulations, Mr. Sterling," she said softly. The guests laughed and toasted to his success, their joy too eager, too loud. Clara gathered her cards carefully, her fingers tracing the edges as though memorizing the feeling of defeat. But while others saw a loss, she saw data. Every twitch, every pause, every overconfident smirk, all filed quietly into her memory. She had lost the hand, but she was learning the man. Richard, basking in his brief triumph, poured himself another drink. "Don't take it too hard," he said. "Luck never favors the inexperienced." She looked up, meeting his gaze with unbroken calm. "Luck," she replied, "has a strange sense of humor." A few nearby guests chuckled, unsure whose side they were laughing with. Richard's smile stiffened. Her silence unsettled him more than anger ever could. He thrived on reactions, applause, outrage, fear, anything that proved his control. But Clara offered none of it. She was polite, efficient, almost detached. Beneath that composure, though, her mind was working with surgical precision. "He moves too quickly when he's nervous," she noted. "And he talks more when he's afraid." The next hand came and went without drama. Clara folded early, letting the game flow around her. She wasn't retreating, she was observing. She noticed how Richard adjusted his cufflinks before bluffing, how his breathing shallowed when the stakes rose. He was a master of image, but image, she realized, was fragile. The cracks had already begun. Between rounds, the waiter passed with champagne. Richard toasted himself, and the guests followed. "To victory," he declared, glass raised high. Clara lifted hers too, but her eyes never left him. His laughter sounded thinner now, as though echoing in an empty hall. Power, she thought, was the most fragile illusion of all. It only lasted as long as others believed it. When the next hand began, she could feel the energy shifting. Richard was speaking faster, showing off for his audience, performing confidence rather than owning it. She smiled faintly, the gesture unreadable. "You enjoy the crowd," she said. He winked. "I enjoy winning." "We'll see," she whispered. Her voice was soft, but it silenced the room for a heartbeat. He won again, but less cleanly, less gracefully. The dealer's nod was tight, the applause restrained. Clara smiled as if in agreement, but there was a shadow in her eyes now. Not pain, not anger, but patience. Richard saw it and looked away. Somewhere deep inside, his victory began to taste like dread. As she stood to leave the table, Richard called out, "Leaving so soon?" She turned to him, expression calm. "Only for now," she said. "Every game needs a break, even for the winner." The line drew a ripple of laughter from the guests, but her gaze held his. Beneath the civility, both of them knew what she meant. She might have lost tonight, but the real game had just begun. The ballroom felt heavier that night, as though the chandeliers themselves were watching. Richard Sterling arrived earlier than usual, the echo of his shoes announcing authority. His smile was wide, but his eyes gave him away. Restless, searching, already unsure. Clara Hayes stood near the service bar, refilling her water glass, pretending not to notice him. Pretending she'd learned was a quiet form of control. "Miss Hayes," Richard said as he approached, voice smooth, calculated. "Back for another chance to lose gracefully?" She turned to face him, calm and polite. "I didn't realize grace was something you could lose, Mr. Sterling." The words were simple, almost kind, but they hit like truth disguised as courtesy. A few guests nearby paused mid-conversation. He forced a laugh, the kind that buys time. Pride was his armor, but even armor grows heavy when worn too long. "You're bold for a receptionist," he said. "Maybe too bold." She smiled faintly. "Or maybe too patient." It was the first moment he looked unsure, the first visible crack in the polished mask he wore like a crown. The dealer arrived, uninvited, but expected. Cards were shuffled, chips stacked, and the table came alive again. This time Clara sat without hesitation. She wasn't playing for money, she was playing for balance. Each hand, each movement was deliberate. Around them, curiosity turned to tension. The crowd had begun to sense it. Something was shifting beneath the glitter. Richard's laughter returned, louder than necessary. He played aggressively, tossing chips with showy flair. The guests clapped after every win, their loyalty shallow but loud. Clara didn't flinch. She played fewer hands, watching him closely. Every victory of his was smaller, emptier, his celebration forced. Pride was beginning to sound like panic. At one point, he knocked over a glass in his haste to impress. The liquid spread across the table like a slow confession. Clara reached out first, steadying the glass before it fell completely. Their hands brushed. His trembled. The crowd pretended not to notice, but everyone felt it. The energy had changed. She was the stillness. He was the storm. The dealer waited for Richard's nod before continuing, but his hesitation said enough. "Shall we?" Clara asked softly. Her tone wasn't mocking. It was merciful. That made it worse. He straightened his cuffs, forcing composure. "Of course," he muttered. The game resumed, but his rhythm was gone. She had taken the one thing money couldn't buy: control of pace. When she finally won a small hand, she didn't smile. The audience applauded politely, unsure of the rules anymore. "Beginner's luck," Richard said quickly, clinging to the old narrative. "Then I must be very lucky tonight," Clara replied, eyes level. The room went still again, a silence both beautiful and dangerous. Pride had never felt so fragile. He played faster, desperate to prove something. But haste made him sloppy, predictable. Clara matched each move with quiet precision, folding when needed, staying when it mattered. She wasn't trying to beat him anymore. She was letting him unravel himself. Power, she realized, was rarely stolen. It was surrendered. By the end of the night, his laughter was gone. The applause had faded too, replaced by unease. Richard leaned back in his chair, his smile brittle as glass. "You look tired," Clara said gently. It wasn't an insult, just observation. He blinked once, unable to find a reply. For the first time, Richard Sterling, the man who owned everything, had nothing left to say. The room had gone quiet long before anyone noticed. The cards moved, the glasses clinked, but the rhythm had changed. Richard Sterling was no longer the charming host. He was a man unraveling in public. Every time Clara Hayes matched his move, his pulse quickened, his composure frayed. She saw it in the small things, the tapping of his ring, the tremor in his hand. Pride was cracking and everyone could hear it. Then it happened. Richard slammed his hand on the table, the sound slicing through the air. "You're cheating!" he snapped. His voice echoed against the marble walls, louder than the orchestra's silence. Gasps rippled across the room. Clara froze, not from guilt but disbelief. The accusation hung between them like smoke, thick, ugly, and desperate. The dealer looked up, startled. "Sir, I've seen no—" "I saw it!" Richard barked, rising from his seat. "No one plays like this unless they're hiding something." His tone wasn't conviction, it was panic in disguise. Around them, guests exchanged glances. The powerful man they'd once admired now looked unsteady, smaller under the weight of his own voice. Clara stood slowly, her chair scraping softly against the floor. "You saw me," she said evenly, "because I wasn't hiding." Her voice was calm, but it carried through the room with the strength of truth unafraid. The words hit him harder than any defense could have. He blinked, unable to look away. The crowd, sensing a shift, fell into reverent silence. Richard took a step forward, his anger faltering beneath her steadiness. "You're twisting this," he said. "You embarrassed me." Clara shook her head gently. "I didn't need to," she replied. "You did that yourself." The chandelier's light shimmered between them, like judgment itself, and in that glow, arrogance looked very much like fear. The dealer cleared his throat, holding up the deck. "Her play is clean," he said firmly. "No marks, no irregularities. She's within the rules." The guests began to murmur, their loyalty dissolving. Richard looked around, realizing the room no longer belonged to him. The silence pressed against his chest, like consequence made visible. Clara gathered the cards she'd been dealt, aligning their edges perfectly. "Maybe," she said softly, "you just weren't watching close enough." It wasn't a taunt. It was mercy disguised as precision. The crowd understood it, even if Richard didn't. For the first time in his life, a room full of people saw through him. And he felt it. He sank back into his chair, eyes unfocused, the adrenaline fading into something colder. Shame. No one laughed this time. The orchestra, sensing the gravity, stopped entirely. Clara stood still for a moment, her breathing steady, her heart loud in her chest. Then, without a word, she turned toward the exit. Her footsteps echoed down the marble hall like distant thunder. The guests parted silently, unsure whether to look at her or away. Behind her, Richard remained seated, staring at the cards as though they'd betrayed him. In truth, they hadn't. They'd simply shown the kind of man he was, when no one else was losing. At the doorway, Clara paused and looked back once, not at him, but at the table itself. The green felt glowed softly beneath the chandelier, like a battlefield turned holy ground. Then she walked into the night, carrying nothing but silence, the kind that follows revelation, the kind that leaves the guilty trembling. The city's heartbeat thudded faintly beneath the drizzle of midnight rain. Clara Hayes walked home alone, her red vest tucked under her arm, her reflection flickering in every puddle she passed. The streets of Manhattan glittered with indifferent light, each taxi a reminder that the world never stopped for personal storms. Her steps were slow, steady, but her thoughts burned like restless embers. Tonight, victory felt too heavy to hold. When she reached her small apartment, the familiar scent of coffee and paper met her at the door. She slipped off her shoes, her body exhausted but her mind wide awake. The silence inside was absolute, no laughter, no whispers, just the echo of what had been said. She placed her keys on the counter and leaned against the wall, the hum of the refrigerator her only companion. For a long time, she just stood there, breathing through disbelief. She replayed the night in fragments. Richard's anger, the crowd's silence, her own voice refusing to tremble. Every detail cut deeper the more she thought about it. She hadn't wanted to expose him. She only wanted to keep her dignity intact. But the truth, once spoken aloud, rarely comes without cost. "Did I go too far?" she whispered to the quiet. The room didn't answer. She poured herself a glass of water and watched her hands shake. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the tremor of release. For months, she had endured the weight of condescension, swallowed insults dressed as jokes. Now that she had stood up, she didn't feel triumph. She felt hollow, uncertain of whether justice could exist without wounding someone else. By the window, the rain traced paths down the glass like tears she refused to shed. Beyond it, the skyline glowed faintly, tall, unbothered and eternal. Somewhere in that maze of light, Richard Sterling still sat in his tower, surrounded by things money could buy, but peace could not. She wondered if he was thinking about her at all, or if pride had already rewritten the story in his mind. She sank into the small couch, curling her knees beneath her. On the coffee table, a deck of cards lay open, her father's deck, edges soft from years of shuffling. She picked up the Queen of Hearts, the same card she had kept for courage. "Patience," her father's voice whispered through memory. "Let truth defend itself." She closed her eyes, letting that thought settle over her heartbeat. Outside, thunder murmured like a memory returning. The rain turned to a steady rhythm, tapping softly against the windowpane. Clara's breathing matched it, slow and measured. The world outside seemed distant now, a blur of lights and noise that couldn't touch her here. She realized then that silence wasn't emptiness. It was protection, the space where healing begins. Her mind drifted to her mother's words. "The world won't always clap for kindness." She smiled faintly, tiredly. Kindness, she thought, didn't need applause. It just needed endurance. She pressed the card between her palms as if praying with it. Her doubt softened, replaced by the fragile warmth of faith, not in people, but in what she had chosen to be. When the clock struck 2, she finally lay down. The city outside pulsed like a heartbeat she no longer had to match. Somewhere above, the clouds parted enough for the moon to spill its light across her floor. She stared at it until her eyes blurred. It wasn't forgiveness she sought tonight, it was understanding. And for the first time, she felt she might find it. Sleep came slowly, like mercy approaching from a distance. Her last thought before surrendering to it was simple, clean, and true. Tomorrow will come, and I will be ready. Outside, the rain eased, leaving behind the quiet hum of renewal, the kind that follows every storm worth surviving. Morning broke gently over the city, spilling light through clouds washed clean by rain. Clara Hayes woke to the sound of buses and birds, the first honest music she'd heard in days. She brewed a small pot of coffee, the aroma filling her apartment with comfort that no applause could match. As she sat by the window, the steam rising before her face, she realized she no longer felt anger, only calm curiosity about what might come next. When she arrived at the hotel, the atmosphere felt changed. Conversations hushed as she passed, but the usual sharpness was gone. The same people who once laughed now avoided her eyes, not out of disdain, but guilt. Even Richard Sterling's name carried differently through the halls, no longer commanding, almost cautious. Clara didn't seek revenge. She simply returned to her duties, graceful as ever, her silence now the loudest presence in the room. At noon, she found a note folded neatly beneath her keyboard. The handwriting was uneven but careful. "You played with dignity. Some of us noticed." Tucked inside was an old playing card, the Queen of Hearts. Her breath caught. She turned it over in disbelief, fingertips brushing the worn edges. Somehow, it had come back to her, carrying the weight of unseen kindness. Moments later, a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Guess that card knows who it belongs to?" said Mr. Coleman, the hotel's elderly janitor, leaning on his broom. His smile was gentle, lined with years of quiet wisdom. "Found it near the ballroom last night. Figured it would mean something to you." Clara nodded slowly, her throat tightening. "More than I can say," she whispered. He chuckled softly, eyes kind. "People like Sterling forget that courage isn't loud," he said. "It's steady." His words landed in her heart like sunlight through dust. Coleman tilted his head. "You held your ground without shouting. That's something most of us never learn." Then, after a pause, he added, "You reminded me of my daughter." The weight of that comparison made her chest ache in the best way. The day unfolded more gently after that. Guests who once ignored her began to smile. A colleague left a coffee on her desk without a word. Even the air in the lobby seemed lighter, the crystal chandeliers catching sunlight instead of judgment. Clara moved through her tasks with ease, her steps quiet but sure. Hope had returned, not loud, but alive. Later, during her break, she sat on the front steps of the hotel, watching the city pulse around her. She held the Queen of Hearts between her fingers, tracing the faded red lines. A breeze lifted her hair, carrying the faint scent of rain and possibility. "Thank you," she murmured to no one in particular, unsure whether she meant her father, Coleman, or life itself. When she returned to her desk, a guest approached, an older woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much. "I was there that night," the woman said softly. "You were brave, my dear, not because you won, because you stayed yourself." Clara's breath caught again. "Thank you," she whispered. The woman smiled, pressing a folded note into her hand before walking away. Clara opened it once she was alone. Inside was a single sentence written in elegant cursive. "Dignity is the only bet that always wins." She read it twice, her vision blurring with tears she didn't fight this time. The note trembled in her hands, as if alive. She placed it gently beside the Queen of Hearts, the two symbols of grace now resting together. That evening, as she left work, the setting sun painted the glass towers gold. She looked up, smiling faintly. The world had not changed, but she had, and in that simple shift, everything felt lighter. Hope, she realized, didn't arrive with trumpets or applause. It came in whispers, in kindness, in cards that find their way back home. 3 nights passed before the invitation arrived. The envelope was heavy, the paper thick, and the handwriting precise. Private game, same place, tonight. No signature, none needed. Clara Hayes traced her finger along the embossed gold seal and felt a strange calm. She had feared this moment once. Now she welcomed it. Fate had come full circle, but she was no longer the same woman. The ballroom was different this time. Dimmer, quieter, stripped of its usual excess. Only a handful of guests lingered by the walls, curious but restrained. Richard Sterling stood near the poker table, his tailored suit immaculate, but his confidence frayed. When he saw Clara enter, he straightened too quickly, as though trying to rise into his old self. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. She smiled softly. "Neither did I." They sat across from each other again, the same table that had once divided them. The dealer, a young man unfamiliar to both, began to shuffle. The sound of cards sliding across green filled the air like a heartbeat. Richard's hands were steady, but his gaze wavered. Clara's, by contrast, were peaceful. It wasn't defiance, it was understanding. The kind that comes after pain has taught its final lesson. "This isn't about winning," Richard began quietly. "It's about making peace with the game." She tilted her head. "And with yourself?" He hesitated, eyes flickering downward. "That too." The first hand passed in silence. He lost, but didn't flinch. The arrogance that once defined him had softened into something human. Clara noticed, and against her own expectations, felt something close to compassion. He studied her as the dealer reshuffled. "You play differently now," he said. "So do you," she replied. "You've stopped performing." He exhaled through a smile. "Performing was easier." "Pretending always is," she said gently. The exchange hung between them, not sharp, but honest. For the first time their conversation wasn't about power, it was about recognition. As the rounds continued, Richard began to talk. He spoke of his father, the man who taught him that mercy was weakness. He spoke of success and how it had turned him into something he no longer admired. The words spilled out like confession. Clara listened quietly, her eyes never leaving his. Forgiveness, she realized, sometimes begins with simply being heard. Halfway through, he pushed his final bet forward, more symbolic than bold. "No money," he said, "only truth." The dealer nodded. Clara met his gaze. "Then tell me one thing," she said softly. "What did you see that night? In me?" He paused, then whispered, "What I wanted to see in myself." The room seemed to exhale with him, the truth settling like dust in sunlight. They finished the last hand without speaking. Clara won, again, but it no longer felt like victory. Richard leaned back, letting the silence stay. Then he extended his hand across the table, not as a gesture of power, but of peace. "Thank you," he said simply. She took it, her grip steady. For a moment, the entire world felt still, as though grace itself had paused to witness. The onlookers, unsure of what they'd just seen, began to whisper, but Clara didn't hear them. She was watching Richard, the man who had once humiliated her, now sitting in the same light that had once exposed her pain. Pride had been replaced by humility, control by honesty. In his defeat he had finally become whole. When she rose to leave, Richard didn't stop her. He only nodded, his expression soft, grateful. "Good night, Miss Hayes," he said. She smiled faintly. "Good night, Mr. Sterling." And as she stepped out of the Golden Hall, she realized that the game had never really been about cards. It had always been about conscience. The next afternoon, a message arrived on hotel letterhead. Simple, formal, handwritten by Richard Sterling himself. "Please stop by my office, a brief matter to discuss." There was no threat in it, no superiority, just quiet intent. Clara Hayes hesitated for a long moment before folding the paper neatly into her pocket. Curiosity and caution often walked hand in hand, but today curiosity led. The elevator ride to the top floor felt slower than usual. Mirrors reflected her from every angle, 100 Claras staring back, calm, composed, uncertain. When the doors opened, she found his office vast and immaculate, but strangely hollow. The city sprawled beyond the glass walls, all steel and glitter. Richard stood by the window, a shadow among reflections. "You came," he said quietly. "I did," she answered, stepping closer. His desk was organized with precision, save for one photograph turned face down. When she glanced at it, he hesitated before flipping it over. It showed a boy beside a stern-looking man, father and son, bound by blood and expectation. "He built all this," Richard said, his voice low, "and I learned how to wear it." The bitterness in his tone was soft but deep. He poured 2 glasses of water, not whiskey. "My father used to say losing made you invisible," he said, "so I built my life around never losing." He gave a humorless smile. "Turns out, that's its own kind of defeat." Clara studied him carefully, not as the man who'd humiliated her, but as someone finally stripped of armor. "You weren't afraid of losing," she said softly. "You were afraid of disappearing." He nodded slowly, his composure fracturing. "When you called me out that night, I saw him," he whispered. I heard his voice in my own. He looked away, the glass trembling in his hand, and I hated myself for it. The admission was raw, unguarded. Clara felt something shift inside her, pity, not for his pain, but for the boy still trapped inside the man. The silence that followed felt heavier than words. She wanted to say something comforting, but she knew that comfort too soon could rob truth of its meaning. Instead, she sat across from him, allowing the quiet to do its work. Through the window behind him, the skyline shimmered like an ocean of unfinished dreams. Every empire, she thought, hides a wound. After a while, he spoke again. "I spent my life thinking respect came from being feared," he said. "But when you stood there calm and unbroken, I realized fear only keeps people close enough to leave." He looked at her then, truly looked. Not through her, not past her, but at her. The arrogance was gone. What remained was regret, naked and human. Clara stood, placing a hand lightly on the desk. "You don't owe me anything, Richard," she said. "You owe yourself honesty." He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. On the desk, the photograph caught the light again. The boy's uncertain smile reflected in the glass. "Maybe," he murmured, "he just needed someone to see him." Clara smiled faintly. "Then you finally have." He reached into a drawer and pulled out the Queen of Hearts. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. She shook her head. "It found its way back twice already. Maybe it's yours now." He turned it over in his fingers, staring at it like an artifact of forgiveness. For a moment, the symbol of her strength became the token of his redemption. As Clara left the office, the air outside felt lighter, the world below softer. She didn't know what would come next, but something essential had shifted. For the first time, Richard Sterling wasn't her adversary. He was simply a man trying to unlearn his mistakes. And in her heart, she understood that sometimes grace begins when judgment ends. The next evening, the ballroom was alive again, chandeliers blazing, cameras flashing, curiosity pulsing through every whisper. Richard Sterling had called a private event, though nothing about it felt private. The city's elite filled the hall, waiting for spectacle. At the far end of the room, Clara Hayes stood quietly among the staff, unaware she was part of the night's purpose. Fate, it seemed, was ready to close its circle. Richard appeared on stage, immaculate as ever, yet visibly changed. The usual smirk was gone. His eyes carried a weight no money could disguise. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice firm but trembling at its edges. "Tonight isn't about business, it's about truth." The crowd stilled, murmurs falling into uneasy silence. Even power listens when it senses confession. He gestured toward the poker table at the center, the same one that had once humiliated Clara. "Some of you were here the night I forgot what dignity looks like," he said, "and some of you laughed while it happened." A few faces turned pale, others looked away. "That night," Richard continued, "I thought I was proving strength, but all I proved was how fear can wear a suit and call itself pride." The dealer hesitated at the table's edge, unsure whether to leave or stay. Richard motioned for him to remain. "I don't need cards to lose this time," he said. "I already did." Then he turned to the back of the room, where Clara stood still. "Miss Hayes," he said softly, "would you join me?" The entire hall turned, following his gaze. Clara stepped forward slowly, every eye on her. Her heels clicked against marble like echoes of the past. When she reached the table, Richard's voice faltered. "You showed me what strength really is," he said. "It's not in winning or money or being feared. It's in standing with grace when the world tries to break you." A hush swept through the crowd, reverent, almost prayerful. He took a breath, as though steadying himself against invisible weight. "I accused you of cheating because I couldn't face losing, not to a woman, not to my own reflection. I was wrong." His voice cracked, raw and unguarded. The words hung in the air like absolution. Clara's eyes softened, not with triumph, but with understanding. "The truth doesn't break people, Richard," she said. "It rebuilds them." The dealer moved beyond duty, set the deck on the table anyway. "One last hand," he offered quietly. Richard smiled faintly. "Not to win," he said, "to remember." He placed his cards down, face up, without even looking. The gesture was simple, symbolic. Surrender not of the game, but of the man he used to be. Clara picked up one card, the Queen of Hearts, and set it on top of his. "You already have what you were missing," she said softly. "You just stopped seeing it." The card gleamed under the chandelier, the crimson heart catching the light like a flame reborn. Around them, the crowd exhaled, unsure whether to clap or weep. Richard looked at her, voice barely above a whisper. "You've forgiven me," he said. "I didn't ask." "You didn't have to," she replied. "You learned." Her words weren't sentimental. They were truth spoken without need for decoration. Forgiveness, after all, was never about erasing the past. It was about refusing to repeat it. As applause finally broke the silence, Clara stepped back, letting him have his moment. Richard stood taller than he had in years, not because of pride, but because of release, and in that golden light, surrounded by people who finally saw the man beneath the myth, Clara Hayes smiled quietly. The confrontation was over, but the healing had only just begun. Applause filled the ballroom like rain after drought, hesitant, cleansing, real. No one cheered for money or spectacle this time. They clapped for what they'd just witnessed. Humility standing beside grace. Richard Sterling remained by the table, shoulders squared but eyes wet, while Clara Hayes watched in calm silence. The game that had begun as cruelty had ended as confession. He turned to the crowd, his voice trembling but sincere. "All my life, I thought respect could be earned through control," he said. "But I learned it's something you give before you receive." He looked toward Clara. "She showed me that strength doesn't need to shout, it just needs to endure." Every head in the room lowered slightly, as if ashamed of having once laughed. Richard stepped away from the table, closer to her. "Miss Hayes," he said, "I can't undo what I did that night, but I can start by doing what I should have done then, acknowledge you." He paused, collecting himself. "You didn't just play a game, you taught me one." The silence that followed was thick, but soft, reverent, not tense. Clara met his gaze, the same calm in her eyes that had once undone him. "It wasn't my lesson to teach," she said quietly. "You were just ready to learn." The humility in her voice pierced deeper than pride ever could. For a fleeting moment, the man who once mocked her now looked at her with something close to awe. Then, in front of everyone, Richard turned to the microphone. "From this day forward," he announced, "Miss Hayes will head our new community relations program. She'll represent this company, and what it should stand for, better than I ever did." Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by stunned silence. Recognition had finally arrived, honest and deserved. Clara blinked, caught between disbelief and gratitude. "If it's about the work, not the image," she said, "then I'll accept." Richard smiled faintly, humbled. "Only the work," he promised. It wasn't a gesture of power, it was surrender turned to partnership. The applause that followed wasn't loud, it was warm, human, healing. As the evening wound down, people approached her not with gossip, but with respect. "You reminded us what dignity looks like," one guest said. Another whispered, "We needed to see that." Their words didn't inflate her, they grounded her. For once, admiration didn't feel like pity, it felt like truth. Richard lingered by the table. The green felt now an altar of lessons learned. "You were right that night," he said softly. "Control isn't respect." Clara nodded. "And losing isn't weakness." Their exchange was quiet but final, a closing of the circle that began with mockery and ended in mutual grace. The crowd thinned, laughter turning gentle, no longer cruel. Clara stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching reflections shimmer across the marble floor. The same chandeliers that once mocked her now glowed softer, kinder. She exhaled slowly, her heart light. The weight she carried for so long had finally lifted. When she left that night, the city air felt new. Richard watched her go, understanding that some victories belonged to those who never demanded them. And as she stepped into the cool glow of streetlights, Clara Hayes smiled faintly. The world, she thought, had just learned to applaud something better than power. It had learned to recognize grace. The morning after the event, the city woke under a gentle haze. The noise that usually filled Manhattan felt softer, as though the world itself had paused to breathe. Clara Hayes sat by a cafe window across from the hotel, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup. The light caught in her hair, turning it gold for an instant. For the first time in months, her thoughts were still. The door opened, and Richard Sterling stepped in, not with his usual entourage, but alone. His suit was grey, simple, almost modest. He scanned the room, spotted her, and approached with uncertain steps. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the seat across from her. Clara nodded, her expression calm. The tension that once charged the air between them had dissolved into quiet acceptance. He sat down slowly, resting his hands on the table. "I keep thinking about what you said," he began. "About grace." She looked at him, waiting. "I've built my life on taking," he continued. "But that night, you gave me something without asking for anything back." His words trembled, yet they carried truth. "That's what I never understood. Giving without wanting to win." Clara stirred her coffee, the spoon clinking softly against porcelain. "You were never missing power, Richard," she said. "You were missing peace." He let out a breath that sounded like relief. "I suppose they're not the same, are they?" She shook her head gently. "No. One controls others. The other controls itself." For the first time he smiled, not the practiced grin of charm, but something real. They spoke about work, about the program he'd started in her name, about change. Richard's plans were small but genuine: scholarships for staff, partnerships with local shelters, fairer treatment for everyone who kept his empire running. "I'm not trying to fix my image," he said, "just my conscience." Clara nodded. "That's the only repair that lasts." When the conversation paused, the silence felt comforting. Richard looked out the window, watching people hurry by. "You know," he said, "I don't think I've ever just sat like this before. No meeting, no deal, no mask." "Then this is your first win," she replied with a small smile. He laughed softly, shaking his head. "You always did have the better hand." He stood to leave, placing enough money on the table to cover both their coffees. "I'll see you at the office tomorrow," he said, voice lighter now. "Not as a boss," he added quickly, "but as someone still learning." Clara smiled. "Learning's a good start." Their eyes met for a brief moment. No rivalry, no history, just respect. Later that day, she walked through the hotel lobby, the same marble floor where it all began. The chandeliers above shone softly, their reflections gentle against the glass. Staff greeted her with genuine warmth. The word Miss Hayes no longer sounded like formality, it sounded like honor. She carried herself with ease, her quiet authority unspoken, but felt by everyone around her. That evening, she placed the Queen of Hearts inside a small frame on her desk. It wasn't a trophy, but a reminder that grace isn't weakness and silence isn't surrender. The card's edges were worn, but its color remained bright. It had traveled the arc of her story, from humiliation to healing, never losing its meaning. Before leaving, she passed the ballroom one last time. The poker table, now covered and forgotten, sat beneath the chandelier like an old ghost, finally at rest. She touched its edge gently, her reflection faint in the polished wood. "Thank you," she whispered, not to the table, not to the past, but to everything that had made her whole. Then she turned, walking toward the exit, her steps light as forgiveness. The city kept moving, but Clara Hayes no longer felt the rush to keep up with it. Each morning she walked through the glass doors of the hotel, not as an employee, but as its quiet compass. The same marble floors that once echoed her humiliation now carried her confidence. People greeted her by name, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Dignity had become her signature. On her desk, the framed Queen of Hearts glowed softly in the morning light. Guests often asked about it. "A reminder," she would say, "that grace is never wasted." Some smiled politely, not understanding, but a few paused long enough to feel the weight behind her words. Those were the people who changed, even if just a little. Richard Sterling had changed too. He still ran the company, but the empire no longer ran him. He spoke less, listened more, and carried humility like a quiet apology. His meetings began with gratitude instead of orders, and his laughter, once sharp and performative, now came softly, real. Pride had not vanished, it had matured. Sometimes he visited her office, bringing 2 coffees and a brief smile. "Still playing the long game?" he'd ask. "Always," she'd answer, and they'd share a silence more meaningful than any conversation. Forgiveness had reshaped them both, not into friends or equals, but into people finally at peace with themselves. Outside, the city stretched in endless motion, its rhythm indifferent to personal triumphs. But Clara had learned to find beauty in the unnoticed, the quiet acts, the unspoken mercies, the small victories of restraint. She realized that power didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered, and the world leaned in to listen. In the evenings, she often lingered in the empty lobby. The chandeliers dimmed to a soft glow. The sound of distant traffic blended with the hum of her own thoughts. She would look around and remember the girl who once stood there in fear, and how that same girl had turned humiliation into harmony. Her calm was no longer armor. It was home. Once, as she was leaving, she found a handwritten note on her desk. It was unsigned, but she recognized the slanted script. "Grace changes more than victory ever will." She smiled, placing it beneath the framed card. It was the kind of message that needed no sender. Some truths, she had learned, travel on their own. Years later, people would still whisper about the night the billionaire fell silent before the receptionist who wouldn't break. They called her brilliant, brave, extraordinary. But Clara never saw herself that way. "I was just patient," she'd say when asked. "Patience looks a lot like genius when no one else has it." The world had returned to its rhythm, but Clara's story lingered, not in headlines, but in hearts. She had proven that intelligence without kindness is noise, and kindness without strength is silence. But when the two meet, they create music the world cannot ignore. As she stepped into the night, the city lights shimmered like cards mid-shuffle, endless and bright. She smiled, knowing life would deal its hands again, fair or not, and she would always be ready. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness, courage, and redemption. Because sometimes the quietest players leave the loudest echoes.